Victor Harrington's fingers closed around Clara's wrist like a trap snapping shut, and he smiled the way men smile when they believe no one is watching. "Say one word," he murmured, "and your father will be begging in the street by morning." If you have never heard a story like this one, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Bennett did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming was a luxury that belonged to women whose fathers owned the room. Her father did not own this room. He did not own much of anything anymore, though the rest of Boston had not been told that yet, and keeping that secret had become the quiet, exhausting work of Clara's entire life for the past 2 years. So when Victor Harrington's hand closed around her wrist in the narrow hallway just off the main ballroom of the Langford estate, when the music swelled on the other side of the wall, and the laughter of 200 of Boston's finest citizens filtered through the wallpaper like it belonged to a different world entirely, Clara did not scream. She went very still, the way a person goes still when they understand that panic will cost them more than they can afford. Victor was smiling. That was the thing about Victor Harrington that Clara had always found most disturbing. Not his power, not his connections, not the way half the city's businessmen folded like paper whenever he walked into a room. It was the smile. It never changed. It was the same smile he wore when he donated to the Children's Hospital, and the same smile he wore right now, here in this hallway, with no witnesses, and his hand around her wrist, and the truth of what he had just told her still echoing inside her chest like a gunshot. "You're going to want to let go of me," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Victor tilted his head, amused by her. He was always amused by her. She was to him a small and manageable problem. A bookkeeper's daughter playing at a world she did not belong to. The fact that she had overheard his conversation with her father tonight, the fact that she had stood in the shadows of this very hallway and listened to him lay out in precise and elegant terms exactly how he planned to destroy the Bennett family's textile company and walk away with the assets, that was an inconvenience. Nothing more. "Clara," he said, saying her name the way you say a word that doesn't quite mean anything. "Your father made a mistake coming to me for help 3 years ago. But that was his mistake to make. What happens next depends entirely on how wisely you choose to behave." "You told him you were a partner," Clara said. "He showed me the original agreement. You called yourself a silent partner." "I am silent," Victor said pleasantly. "When it suits me. You've been siphoning money out of Bennett Textiles for 2 years. I've seen the books." Something shifted behind Victor's eyes. Just slightly. Just enough that Clara registered it and filed it away, even as her wrist throbbed where his grip had tightened. "You've seen the books," he repeated. "I do all the bookkeeping myself. My father trusted me with that because he trusted me with everything. Yes, Mr. Harrington, I've seen the books. I know what you've been taking. I know how you've been hiding it." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then the smile returned wider and cooler than before, and Clara understood that she had just made herself a much larger problem than she had been 60 seconds ago. "Then you understand," he said softly, "that you have 2 choices. You can be quiet, and your family loses the business, but keeps its reputation. Your father retires in modest comfort. Your sisters marry reasonably well, and nobody outside this hallway ever knows that Henry Bennett was fool enough to trust a man like me. Or—" He paused, and the pause was deliberate, and practiced the pause of a man who had delivered versions of this speech many times. "You can talk, and I will make sure that every person in that ballroom understands exactly how deep your father's debts go, exactly what arrangements he agreed to, and exactly why the Bennett name should never again be associated with any reputable business in this city. I will take the company and the reputation both. Do you understand me?" Clara's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. She said nothing. She was calculating, which was what she always did when she was afraid. When her mother had died, and her father had collapsed inward with grief, and Clara had been 19 years old, and suddenly responsible for the accounts, the staff, the inventory, and 2 younger sisters, she had calculated. When the first signs of financial trouble had appeared in the ledgers 3 years ago, and she had sat alone at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out how long they had before the creditors came, she had calculated. Panic was the enemy of calculation. She could not afford panic. What she calculated right now was this. Victor Harrington had just admitted out loud to a crime. He had done it casually and without concern, because he genuinely believed that she had no one to go to. That there was no one in that ballroom who would stand beside a bookkeeper's daughter against a man of his standing. He was almost certainly right. Almost. "Let go of my wrist," she said again. "Clara." "I heard you," she said. "I understand your terms. Now let go of my wrist before someone walks by and sees you holding me like this. And then neither of us has to worry about what story gets told tonight, because the only story anyone will be talking about is the one where Victor Harrington was found alone in a hallway with Henry Bennett's daughter and his hand on her arm." She watched him think about that. She watched the calculation move across his face, the same kind of calculation she was doing, and she watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had already reached, that a scene right now served neither of them. He let go. Clara did not rub her wrist. She would not give him that. She was about to step back toward the ballroom when she heard footsteps from the other direction. Firm and unhurried, and then a voice she did not recognize said quietly, and with complete authority, "There you are." The man who appeared at the far end of the hallway was tall, dark-haired, and wearing the kind of tailored evening coat that announced wealth without apology. Clara had seen him across the ballroom earlier in the evening, had noticed him the way you notice someone who seems to generate a small gravitational field around themselves, drawing glances without appearing to invite them. She had not known his name. She had not needed to. Alexander Whitmore. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in Boston knew the name. Railroad money inherited and then dramatically expanded. Famously private. Famously unmarried, which caused considerable distress to the mothers of Boston's eligible daughters. He was 32 years old and had, according to every social column Clara had ever inadvertently read, never shown serious interest in any woman, never allowed himself to be paired publicly with anyone, never participated in the elaborate rituals of courtship that defined their world. I was looking at her now, as if he had been looking for her specifically. He was also taking in Victor's presence, with an expression that revealed nothing whatsoever, which Clara somehow understood was more dangerous than any expression that revealed everything. "I've been searching for you," Alexander said, and he was speaking to her entirely, to her, moving toward her with the ease of a man who had just located something he owned. Clara's mind raced. She had never spoken to this man. He did not know her. Whatever this was, it was not what it appeared to be, and the only question was whether she should play along, or whether she should step back and demand to know what he thought he was doing. She looked at Victor. Victor was watching Alexander with the particular wariness of a man who has just realized his private conversation has been witnessed by someone he cannot dismiss. Clara made her decision in the space of one breath. "I was looking for you as well," she said. "I didn't want to wander back in alone." Alexander reached her side and did something she did not expect. He took her hand, not her wrist, her hand, and the difference between the way he held it and the way Victor had held it a minute ago was so absolute that Clara felt something loosen inside her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding clenched. "Harrington," Alexander said, acknowledging Victor with the kind of nod that conveyed exactly enough respect to remain polite, and not a fraction more. "Whitmore," Victor said. His smile had not moved, but something behind it had gone very carefully still. "I didn't know you and Miss Bennett were acquainted." "We are," Alexander said simply, and his simplicity was its own kind of power. He said it the way a man says a thing that is settled and has been settled for some time and does not require further discussion. Victor looked between them once. Clara held herself very still and looked back at Victor with everything she had, all the steadiness she could muster, all the careful blankness she had spent years perfecting at the bookkeeping table. "Enjoy your evening," Victor said at last, and moved past them back toward the ballroom, and Clara listened to his footsteps recede, and kept listening until she was certain he was gone. Then she turned to look at Alexander Whitmore. I was already looking at her. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what you thought you saw, but thank you. I thought I saw Victor Harrington with his hand on a woman's arm in a way that she clearly did not welcome," Alexander said. "I was not wrong about that." No, Clara admitted. You weren't. He studied her for a moment. Whatever he was looking for, she had no idea if he found it. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to hear the whole question before you answer. Clara waited. I was quiet for 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she could hear the music start again in the ballroom, something lilting and bright, completely indifferent to everything that had just happened in this hallway. Victor Harrington has been a problem I've been trying to solve for 6 months, Alexander said. Whatever he said to you in that hallway, whatever he threatened, I suspect it connects to something I've been building a case around. I need someone who understands accounts, who can read financial records and recognize what's been manipulated. I have the records. I don't have the person. He paused. I am also aware that you are alone in this hallway with me, which is its own kind of problem for your reputation, and that if I escort you back into that ballroom right now, without a plausible reason for why we were both out here together, there will be questions that could cause you difficulty. So I'm going to suggest something, and you can tell me no. Clara looked at him steadily. What are you going to suggest? Alexander Whitmore looked back at her with an expression she would spend the next several months trying to properly describe, and said quietly enough that the words belonged only to the two of them. Pretend you love me. Just for tonight. Let me walk you back into that room as though you are the woman I've been thinking about all evening. Let the story write itself. Victor will not touch you if he believes you are under my protection, and by the time anyone thinks to question it, we'll have had time to figure out the truth. The music swelled again through the wall. Clara thought about her father's face when he did not know she was watching. The way he had started to look smaller. The way he had stopped meeting her eyes. She thought about the ledgers about the transactions she had found that made no sense until suddenly, horribly, they made every sense. She thought about her sisters, who did not know how bad it was, who were in the ballroom right now dancing and laughing and having no idea. She said, "You kiss me before we go back in." Alexander blinked, just slightly. It was the first time something had surprised him. "I beg your pardon. If we walk back in together, it's pleasant but explainable. People will talk for a day and then wonder. If we walk back in and half the room already saw you kiss me, then the story is already written and there's nothing to question." She held his gaze. "You said the story should write itself. I'm saying write it properly or not at all." There was a long pause. Then Alexander Whitmore, the coldest man in Boston's social calendar, looked at Clara Bennett, the woman nobody had noticed all evening, and said, "All right." He kissed her. It was not theatrical. It was not prolonged. It was the kind of kiss that suggested a very great deal without announcing itself, and it lasted exactly long enough that the two couples who happened to be walking past the hallway entrance could see it and would absolutely certainly remember it. When it was done, Clara was aware that her hands were slightly unsteady, and that this was inconvenient, and she filed that information away as something to examine later when she was alone and had time to be inconvenienced. "Ready," Alexander said. "Yes," Clara said, and they walked back into the ballroom. The silence spread from the doorway outward like a stone dropped in still water. Clara felt it before she fully saw it. That ripple of interrupted conversation of turned heads of fans, paused mid-flutter, and champagne glasses held at odd angles while their owners forgot to drink. She had spent her entire adult life being invisible in rooms like this one. She had perfected the art of occupying a corner without drawing attention, of listening, without being heard, of existing in wealthy spaces, without being acknowledged. She was not invisible now. Alexander's hand was at the small of her back, light and steady, and he moved through the room the way he always apparently moved, like a man who was never in a hurry, because the world adjusted its pace to his, and Clara moved with him and kept her chin level and looked straight ahead and reminded herself to breathe. She spotted Victor almost immediately. He was standing near the far window with two other men, and he was watching her, and his smile was gone. Good, Clara thought with a fierceness that surprised her. Good. Margaret Holloway, who was the undisputed curator of Boston's social narrative, and who Clara had exchanged perhaps 14 words with in her entire life, appeared at her elbow within 3 minutes. She was all warm surprise and barely concealed hunger for information. "My dear, I had no idea." Margaret said, her eyes moving between Clara and Alexander with the intensity of someone reading a particularly gripping page. "How long has this been going on?" "Long enough," Alexander said pleasantly, offering nothing else. Margaret looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who is recalibrating everything she thought she knew about a person and finding the process both exciting and slightly annoying. "You are a dark horse, Clara Bennett," she said. "I am exactly who I have always been," Clara said. "People just weren't paying attention." Margaret laughed, surprised into it, and moved away to begin telling everyone what she'd just seen, which was precisely what they needed her to do. Alexander leaned slightly toward Clara and said very quietly near her ear, "That was well handled." "Don't sound surprised," Clara said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm impressed. There's a difference." They spent another 40 minutes in the ballroom. Alexander introduced her to people she had observed from across rooms for years and never expected to speak to directly. She watched how he operated, how he said very little, and absorbed a great deal. How he positioned himself in conversations so that other people talked and he listened, and she recognized the method because it was her own method. The method of someone who had learned that information was more valuable than attention. She was also, despite herself, aware of him. The steadiness of him beside her. The way he occasionally touched her hand or her elbow, always brief, always plausible, always enough to sustain the impression they were creating without ever feeling like a performance. She could not decide if he was simply that good at pretending, or if something else was happening, and she put that thought away as well, in the same mental compartment as her unsteady hands from earlier. Victor left the ballroom at 10:30. Clara tracked his departure in her peripheral vision and felt Alexander register it at the same moment, felt a slight settling in the line of his shoulders, a fraction of tension released. "He'll regroup," Alexander said once they had moved to a quieter corner near the window. The first private words they'd exchanged in an hour. "Tonight bought time, not much else." "How much time do you need?" Clara asked. He looked at her. "To do what?" "To find what you're looking for. You said you have financial records you can't fully interpret. How much time do you need if you have someone who can read them?" Something moved in his expression, carefully. "You're offering." "I'm asking how much time," Clara said. "Which is not the same as offering. Yet." He was quiet. Then, "If the person looking at the records knew what they were doing, and if we had access to the originals rather than copies, I would say 3 weeks, possibly 4. And what would we be looking for specifically?" He studied her for another moment. "Transfers," he said at last. "Accounts that appear legitimate, but exist only on paper. Funds routed through companies that exist only on paper. Someone has been systematically draining money from several Boston businesses, simultaneously moving it in amounts small enough not to trigger alarm over a period of what I believe is at least 5 years. Clara thought about her own ledgers. About the transactions that had troubled her for 2 years, the ones she had attributed to her father's poor record-keeping. The ones that now, in the light of this conversation, presented themselves in an entirely different color. "Someone," she said carefully, "or a pattern that connects back to a single someone." Alexander's eyes sharpened. "What do you know?" "I know my own family's books," Clara said. "And if what you're describing is what I think you're describing, then Bennett Textiles is not the only business Victor Harrington has been quietly dismantling. It's one of many. And I have 2 years of evidence sitting in a ledger book in my father's office that nobody has looked at because nobody thought to look." Alexander went very still. "Clara," he said. And there was something in the way he said her name, something that was nothing like the way Victor had said it an hour ago, that registered in her chest before she had time to prevent it. "If you have what I think you have, and if Victor realizes you know how to read it tonight, was not enough." "I know," she said. "You understand what I'm saying." "I understand exactly what you're saying," Clara said. "Which is why I'm asking how much time you need, because if we're going to do this, we need to do it before he has a chance to get to those records before we do." For the first time all evening, Alexander Whitmore looked at her with something that wasn't calculation. It was something else. Something that if she had been inclined toward optimism, she might have called the beginning of respect. 3 weeks, he said. Can you get the ledgers tomorrow? I can have them tonight if you need them. He shook his head. Tomorrow. Come to my office on Marlborough Street. Come in the morning when there are people around, so there's nothing for anyone to question. And our arrangement? Clara asked. The pretend part. He held her gaze. Until this is resolved, we maintain the impression. It protects you and gives me a legitimate reason to be in contact with your family's business without raising questions about why I'm investigating. And after, something flickered. After, he said, we part as friends, amicably, quietly, in a way that damages neither of us. Clara nodded slowly. That sounds sensible. It is sensible. Alexander agreed, and something about the way he said it was almost too careful, too deliberate, like a man repeating something to himself he is not entirely certain he believes. But Clara was not thinking about that yet. She was thinking about the ledgers, about the transactions, about the look on Victor Harrington's face when he had realized that the woman he thought was a manageable problem was something else entirely. She was thinking about her father and her sisters, and the business that had been her family's livelihood for 3 generations, and the man who had spent 2 years quietly taking it apart from the inside. And she was thinking with a cold and focused clarity that she was going to bring every piece of what she knew into the light, and that whatever it cost her, whatever it required of her, she was going to make sure Victor Harrington could not smile his way out of it. The ballroom went on around them, bright and oblivious. Clara Bennett stood beside a man she had met 2 hours ago, who had put his hand in hers and changed the entire trajectory of her evening, and she made herself a promise. She was done being invisible. And Victor Harrington had no idea what was coming. Clara arrived at Alexander Whitmore's office on Marlborough Street at 8:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before he had told her to come, because she had not slept, and there was nothing left to do at home except sit with her thoughts, and her thoughts had become poor company somewhere around 3 in the morning. She had the ledgers under her arm, both of them. The current one and the one from the year before, bound in brown cloth and smelling faintly of the cedar shelf where her father kept them in his private study. She had taken them after her father went to bed, standing alone in the dark of his office, with a single candle pulling the books down and tucking them under her coat like a woman stealing from herself. Which she supposed was more or less what she was doing, stealing evidence from her own family's wreckage before someone else came to take it. She had not told her father. She could not tell her father. Not yet. Henry Bennett was a proud man who had spent 30 years building something from very little, and the news that his trusted partner had been gutting that something from the inside would not merely hurt him, it would hollow him out. Clara knew this the way she knew the sound of his voice, and the particular way he moved through rooms when he believed no one was watching. Slower now, more careful, like a man navigating a floor he suspected might give way. She had been watching that slowness spread for 2 years and had been telling herself it was grief. Leftover grief from her mother's death, the kind that settles into a person's bones and changes how they carry themselves. It was not only grief. She understood that now. She understood a great many things now that she had spent a sleepless night rearranging. Alexander's assistant, a young man named Thomas, who had the alert, slightly over-caffeinated manner of someone accustomed to unusual situations, showed her into a private meeting room without apparent surprise and brought her tea without being asked. Clara appreciated both these things. She set the ledgers on the table and opened the first one, and was already 3 pages deep in her own annotations when the door opened and Alexander came in. He stopped when he saw the 2 ledgers spread open on the table. He stopped again differently when he saw the pages of notes Clara had made in the margins overnight. Small, precise handwriting, running alongside every flagged transaction, cross-referenced with dates and initials and question marks. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I sleep when the work is done," Clara said, which was something her mother used to say, and which was, she reflected, one of many ways she had become her mother without noticing. Alexander sat down across from her. He had brought his own folders, thick ones, and he laid them open on the table with the efficiency of a man who had also been awake working, though he showed it less than she did. His collar was perfectly pressed. Clara chose not to resent him for this. "Tell me what you found," he said. "Tell me what you have first," Clara said. I want to see if we're finding the same pattern from two different directions." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating something, the small mental adjustment of a man who had expected to run this meeting and was now realizing it was going to be run differently. "Fair," he said. He explained. Been building a case for 6 months, following an anonymous letter sent to his company's auditor. The letter alleged that a series of Boston businesses had been targeted by the same scheme, a silent investment partner who offered advantageous terms, created legitimate-appearing documentation, and then used his position inside the company's financial structures to siphon funds in amounts carefully calculated to fall below the thresholds that would trigger scrutiny. Small bleeds. Dozens of them. Sustained over years. The businesses rarely collapsed dramatically. They simply declined slowly, and then suddenly, in the way that a person who has been quietly losing blood doesn't realize how serious things have become until they try to stand up. Clara listened to every word of this without interrupting. When he finished, she turned the ledger toward him and put her finger on a line from 14 months ago. "This transaction," she said. $32. Listed as a supply adjustment. There is no corresponding invoice in the supply records. I checked every invoice my father kept for that year. This adjustment exists in the ledger and nowhere else." Alexander leaned forward. "How many like it?" "In this ledger alone," Clara said. 47. The amounts vary. Some are as small as $8. The largest is 212. None of them triggered concern on their own because individually they mean nothing. Collectively, they represent a transfer of approximately $3,000 over 18 months, routed through account entries that appear legitimate unless you're specifically looking for the pattern. Alexander was very still. $3,000. From my father's company alone, Clara said. Over 18 months. I don't know how long it was happening before I took over the bookkeeping. She watched him absorb this. She watched the particular expression that moved across his face. Not shock exactly, but the expression of a man who had suspected something was a certain size, and has just been shown it is larger. "The businesses in my files," he said. "There are 9 of them, if each one represents a similar pattern over a similar period. Then we're talking about something significantly larger than $3,000, Clara said. "Yes." The room went very quiet. Then Alexander said, "Clara, in the list of businesses I've been tracking, I need you to look at something." He turned one of his folders toward her. A list of company names handwritten with dates and notes beside each one. Clara scanned it. 7 names she recognized, Boston businesses of varying sizes. Some she knew her father was acquainted with, some she knew only by their storefronts or their advertisements in the transcript. The 9th name stopped her cold. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "Whitmore Railroad is on this list," she said. "Yes," Alexander said. She waited. "I am not only investigating Victor Harrington on behalf of other people," he said. "My company has been targeted as well. The same pattern, the same methodology. The transfers in my accounts are structured differently because my accounts are larger and therefore require a different concealment approach, but the architecture is identical." He paused. "I have a conflict of interest in this investigation. I am aware of it. I have chosen to proceed regardless, because if I hand this to the authorities without the full picture assembled, Victor will dismantle the evidence before anyone with legal standing can act on it. He has done it before." Clara filed this away. "Done it before where?" "Philadelphia," Alexander said. 7 years ago. A similar scheme. A business partner accused him. By the time the case came to hearing, 3 witnesses had recanted 2 sets of documents had been declared forgeries, and Victor walked out with a formal apology from the court. The weight of this landed in Clara's stomach like something cold. "So he has done this before," she said. "And he knows exactly how to make the evidence disappear. Which means," Alexander said, "that anything we find we need to have copied, authenticated, and placed in multiple separate hands before we move. He cannot be allowed to know what we have until it is completely beyond his reach." Clara nodded slowly. "How many people know you're investigating?" 3. My auditor, my attorney, and now you." She absorbed that. The weight of it. The specific gravity of being the fourth person inside this particular secret. "Why me?" she asked, not defensively, genuinely. Alexander considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you already knew something was wrong before last night, and you were handling it alone. Which tells me you don't panic, and you don't run to people who can't help you. Because you suggested we go back into the ballroom the way we did, which tells me you think quickly, and you're willing to act on what you think. And because you showed up this morning with the ledgers already annotated, which tells me you don't wait to be told what needs doing when you already know." Clara looked at him for a moment. "That is an extremely practical list of reasons," she said. "I am an extremely practical man," Alexander said. "So I've heard," Clara said. And then before she could examine the wisdom of it, "I've also heard you don't trust people easily." "I don't," he agreed. "But you trust me." He met her eyes. "I trust your competence," he said carefully. "That is where I'm starting." It was not, Clara told herself, a particularly meaningful distinction. It was the kind of thing a sensible person said. She was a sensible person. She filed it appropriately. "Then let's work," she said. They worked for 4 hours. It was the most concentrated, focused 4 hours Clara could remember spending, which was remarkable, given that the previous record had been a 6-hour stretch, during which she had reconstructed 3 years of misfiled receipts alone, in her father's office at the age of 20. She had forgotten to eat during that as well. She remembered that now because Thomas appeared at some point with a tray of food that neither of them touched until it was cold, and Alexander looked at it with the expression of a man genuinely surprised that time had continued passing while he was not paying attention. What they built across those 4 hours was a map. Not a literal map, but a financial one. A picture of money moving in directions. It should not have moved in amounts too small to see individually and too numerous to ignore collectively. Clara's ledgers connected to Alexander's files in 3 specific places. 3 transactions that appeared in slightly different forms in both sets of records, and that could only have been created by someone with access to both sets of accounts simultaneously. Someone inside both companies. "This," Clara said, pointing to the connection. "This account number. It appears in my father's books as a supplier account. It appears in your records as a maintenance contractor. The account number is the same." Alexander stared at the number. "The same account is listed as 2 different entities in 2 different companies, which means whoever created these entries had physical access to both sets of records," Clara said. "Not just financial access. They would have had to sit down with actual books, actual ledgers, and write these in, or have someone else write them on their instructions." "Victor doesn't do his own bookkeeping," Alexander said. "He has an accountant." "Who?" A pause. "A man named Silas Marsh. He has handled Victor's personal accounts for 12 years, Clara thought. "Is Marsh's name anywhere in your documents?" Alexander went through 3 folders in silence. Then he stopped. He picked up a single page. He read it twice. He set it down and looked at Clara across the table. "Silas Marsh," he said quietly, "is a signatory on one of the shell accounts I've been tracking." The word shell hung between them. "He's not just the bookkeeper," Clara said. "He built the architecture." "Under Victor's instruction," Alexander said. "But yes, he built it." Clara pressed the heels of her hands against the table and breathed. This was the moment she recognized when the thing she had suspected became something she could actually see. When a pattern became a fact. The shift was not dramatic. It was small and cold and absolutely certain, and it changed everything. "We need Marsh," she said. "We need Marsh's records," Alexander said, "which are almost certainly kept somewhere that Victor controls." "Not necessarily," Clara said slowly. "Bookkeepers are meticulous people. I know this because I am a meticulous person. We keep copies. We keep our own copies separate from the official records because we have learned from experience that official records have a way of disappearing when they become inconvenient." She looked at him. "If Marsh has been doing this for 12 years, he has protected himself somehow. Not out of goodness, out of self-preservation. Because a man like Victor Harrington would sacrifice his bookkeeper the moment it became necessary, and a man like Silas Marsh would know that. Alexander looked at her with that careful, measuring quality that she was beginning to recognize as the face he wore when something had shifted his thinking. "You're saying Marsh has leverage," he said. "I'm saying Marsh has documents," Clara said. "And that a man who has spent 12 years helping a predator eat other people alive is a man who has been very quietly terrified that one day he would be eaten too. That kind of terror is motivating. It makes people careful." "Could you find someone like that?" Alexander asked. "Could you recognize him?" Clara smiled very slightly, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has spent years in rooms full of people operating under various degrees of concealed fear, and has learned to read it the way other people read weather. "Bring me into a room with Silas Marsh," she said, "and I will tell you in 20 minutes whether he has what we need." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You understand that if Victor realizes we're moving toward Marsh, he will accelerate. Whatever his timeline is, he will move it forward." "I know," Clara said, "which means we have to move first." Alexander stood up. He walked to the window, his back to her, and Clara watched the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness he carried, and thought not for the first time that this was a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had become so accustomed to the weight that he no longer noticed it the way other people would. "There's something else," he said without turning around. Clara waited. "Victor was at my father's funeral," Alexander said. 4 years ago. He came and shook my hand and told me my father was a great man and that the city of Boston had lost something irreplaceable." He paused. "I thanked him. I stood there and thanked him. And I had no idea." Clara said nothing. She understood that this was not the moment for words. It was the moment for witnessing, for staying very still, while someone set something heavy down briefly and let themselves feel the weight of it. Alexander turned back around. His face had closed over again smoothly and completely, the way a door closes when someone decides the room needs to be private. "We'll need to approach Marsh carefully," he said. "Not at his office. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere he feels like he has a choice." "Does he have a family?" Clara asked. "A wife. 2 daughters." "Then he has everything to lose," Clara said. "Which means he has everything to use. Give me a week to find out where he takes his lunch." Alexander looked at her. "You're going to surveil Victor Harrington's private accountant." "I'm going to observe a man's daily routine," Clara said. "I do it with ledgers all the time. The principle is the same." He laughed. It was quiet and short, and it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. And the room felt slightly different afterward, like a window had been cracked open somewhere. "All right," he said. 1 week. The social performance of their arrangement, meanwhile, had taken on a life entirely its own. Clara had not anticipated the speed of it. Within 24 hours of the Langford ball, she had received 4 calling cards, 2 personal notes, and an invitation to a ladies' luncheon she had never previously been considered eligible to attend. Boston's social machinery operated on the same principles as its financial one. Information moved in self-interested directions and compounded over time, and the information that Clara Bennett was. Alexander Whitmore's chosen woman compounded rapidly and dramatically. Her youngest sister Eliza, who was 22, and found the social world an endlessly fascinating puzzle, could barely contain herself at breakfast the morning after. Mrs. Alderton told Mrs. Pierce, who told Mother's friend Helen, that Alexander Whitmore has not looked at a woman seriously in 6 years. Eliza said, leaning forward over her tea with the focused energy of someone receiving vital intelligence. 6 years, Clara. Why 6 years? I have no idea, Clara said, which was true. And he just appeared last night out of nowhere. He was at the same party, Clara said. It's not mysterious. Clara. Eliza gave her the look that 22-year-olds give older sisters who are being deliberately obtuse. He kissed you in front of half of Boston's finest families. That is extremely mysterious. Clara concentrated on her breakfast. Are you happy? Eliza asked then, and the question came differently, quieter, stripped of the breathless social excitement. She was looking at Clara with the directness that Clara had always both loved and found difficult to navigate, because Eliza had their mother's eyes and their mother's habit of seeing through the things Clara most wanted to keep private. "I am focused on what needs to be done," Clara said carefully. "That isn't what I asked." "I know." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. "He seemed kind," she said finally. "When I watched him with you across the room, he seemed like he was paying attention to you, the real kind of attention, not the kind men pay to women they're trying to impress." Clara said nothing. "Just," Eliza said, standing up and collecting her tea. "Don't forget that you're allowed to want things, Clara. You spend so much time taking care of everyone else's things that you forget you have your own." She left, and Clara sat alone with her breakfast and her careful compartments, and the extremely inconvenient fact that what Eliza had just said was going to take up more space in her mind than she had allocated for it. The week that followed was the strangest of Clara's life, and her life had contained some notably strange periods. She and Alexander met every other day, always in circumstances that were plausibly social, always surrounded by enough other people to make the meetings unremarkable. They danced at the Merit Assembly. They attended a lecture series at the Athenaeum. They took 2 carriage rides in the common, visible and unhurried, the precise image of a couple with nothing to conceal. And between these visible appearances they worked. Clara tracked Silas Marsh. She was good at it. She discovered very good at it in the way that people who have spent years moving through spaces while being overlooked are good at observation. She knew how to look like she was not looking. She knew how to position herself in a room so that she was present without being registered. She watched Marsh for 7 days, and by the end of those 7 days, she knew his routine with the precision of a timetable. She brought Alexander the information over tea at the Atwood house, where 6 other couples were having conversations in close proximity, and the sound of it all made their own conversation perfectly private. "He lunches alone every Tuesday and Thursday," she said, her voice low enough to be inaudible 2 feet away. "Always at Dalton's. Always the same table, rear corner facing the door. He orders the same meal each time. He sits for exactly 40 minutes, and he reads while he eats, always a newspaper, never a book. You're certain he's alone, always. He has no companions for these meals. The waitstaff knows him, he's been coming there for years, but he doesn't linger or make conversation. He reads, he eats, he leaves." "A man practicing solitude," Alexander said. "A man practicing vigilance," Clara said. "There's a difference. He sits facing the door because he wants to see who comes in before they see him. He goes to the same place every time because predictability feels safer than the unknown. He is a man who has spent years calculating risk." She paused. "He's also a man who orders the apple pie every single time and doesn't start eating it until he's finished the newspaper, which means there are approximately 12 minutes once the pie arrives where he is relaxed enough for a real conversation." Alexander looked at her with the expression that she had privately begun cataloging as his impressed look. It was subtle and would have been invisible to most people, but Clara had spent 2 weeks watching his face, and she had learned to read it. "Next Thursday," he said. "Next Thursday," she agreed. What neither of them said across the civilized distance of their tea table was what both of them were aware of, that somewhere on the other side of the city, Victor Harrington was also making calculations. That he had not reacted to the Langford ball the way Clara had hoped. That he had gone quiet in a way that was not the quiet of a man retreating. It was the quiet of a man regrouping, 2 days before their planned meeting with Silas Marsh. Clara arrived home to find that her father's office had been searched, not ransacked. That was the word she had expected, the dramatic word, the word that would have confirmed what she feared in a satisfying and terrible way. But it was not that. It was almost surgical. The room was tidy. The books were on the shelves. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, except that Clara knew her father's office, the way she knew her own face, and 3 drawers had been gone through and replaced with a millimeter's difference in position and the false bottom of the lower filing cabinet. The one her father had shown her when she took over the bookkeeping. The one where he kept the original company charter, and her mother's copy of the founding deed had been opened. She stood in the doorway of her father's office for a long time without moving. Victor knew about the ledgers. He had not found them here because she had already taken them. But he knew she had them, or suspected she did, and he was moving now, which meant their window had closed faster than either she or Alexander had planned for. She went to the writing desk in the hallway and wrote a note in the rapid shorthand she had developed for the financial annotations, the shorthand that anyone else would look at and see as random numbers and abbreviations, and she sent it with Thomas, who was apparently available at all hours for exactly this kind of errand to Marlborough Street. Alexander appeared at her door within the hour. He read the note in the entry hall while Clara watched his face. When he looked up, he said, "We move tomorrow." "Marsh meets on Thursday," Clara said. "That's 3 days." "We can't wait 3 days," Alexander said. "If Victor is searching your father's office, he's already decided you're a liability. Which means your father is a liability. Which means the arrangement I promised you, the one where your family stays out of the visible portion of this, is no longer viable." Clara felt the cold of this travel through her, with the particular clarity of a thing you already knew coming into focus. "What do we do?" she said. Alexander said, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before." He said it with a gravity that stopped her breath. "My father," he said slowly, "did not die of a natural illness." The entry hall was very quiet. Clara said, "What do you mean?" "4 years ago, my father collapsed suddenly," Alexander said. "The physician ruled it cardiac failure. It was a reasonable ruling. He was 61 years old, and he had worked hard for 40 years, and there was no specific reason to doubt it." He paused. "Except that 3 months before he died, he had begun his own investigation into financial irregularities in the company's accounts. He had found the same pattern we found, and he had written it down." Clara went completely still. "He wrote it down," she said, "in a journal. A private accounting journal, where he kept his personal observations separate from the official records. I found it 2 years after he died, going through boxes I had not had the heart to open. I found it, and I read it, and I understood that he had been close to what we are close to now." Alexander's voice did not break. It stayed even and controlled, but Clara heard the thing underneath it, the thing it cost him to keep it controlled. "And then I started asking questions about who had access to his private office in the months before he died, and one of the names that came up repeatedly was Silas Marsh." The cold that had settled in Clara's chest expanded. "Victor didn't just steal from your family," she said. "I don't know what Victor did," Alexander said. "I don't have proof. I have suspicion. I have timing. I have a pattern that I cannot yet prove is anything other than coincidence." He looked at her directly. "But I believe my father was not allowed to finish what he started, and I intend to finish it for him, whatever it takes." Clara looked back at him for a long moment, at this careful, contained man who had watched her from across a ballroom and made a calculated decision that changed both their lives, and she thought about the cost of what he was carrying, the specific weight of suspecting something terrible and not being able to prove it, and having to live inside that uncertainty for 4 years. She thought about the ledgers under her arm, the night of the ball, and the way she had taken them like a woman stealing from herself, and the promise she had made in the bright, careless noise of that ballroom. "Tomorrow," she said. "We go to Marsh tomorrow." Alexander nodded. "And Alexander," she said. He waited. "Whatever happened to your father," she said quietly, "it will not happen to what we're building. I won't let it." He looked at her with something she could not quite name. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and quieter and more serious than gratitude. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been told by someone he has come to trust that he does not have to carry it alone anymore. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They went to Marsh the next morning. Not together. That was the first thing Alexander and Clara had agreed on the night before, standing in her entry hall with the weight of everything he had just told her still settling between them like sediment after a storm. Two people approaching Silas Marsh at the same time would signal coordination. It would signal threat. A man as carefully frightened as Marsh would see two people coming, and he would close like a fist, and nothing they said afterward would open him again. So Clara went first. She arrived at Dalton's 20 minutes before Marsh's usual time, took a table 2 rows from his corner, and ordered tea and a copy of the morning paper. She had dressed carefully. Not richly, that would be wrong. A wealthy woman had no reason to speak to him. Not poorly either. She wore the dark blue wool dress she wore when she met with suppliers, practical and clean and forgettable, the clothes of a woman who worked and did not apologize for it. She looked like someone who belonged in the same world. Marsh inhabited the world of careful people who kept other people's accounts and knew better than most exactly how fragile respectability actually was. Marsh arrived at 11:05. He moved through the room without making eye contact with anyone, the particular gait of a man who had learned to pass through spaces without leaving impressions, and settled into his corner table with the practiced efficiency of long habit. The waiter brought him his newspaper before he asked. He ordered his meal without looking at the menu. Clara watched him without watching him. She read 3 paragraphs of the same article 4 times and did not absorb a word of them. How was older than she had expected from Alexander's description. 60s probably, with the papery, careful look of a man who had spent decades indoors with numbers. The kind of pallor that came not from illness, but from a life of deliberate diminishment, of making yourself small enough that nothing large enough to crush you could find you. His hands when he unfolded his newspaper were precise and steady. The hands of someone who wrote in very small, very neat handwriting. She recognized something in him that she had not anticipated recognizing. She recognized a person who was tired. Not tired the way people were tired after a poor night's sleep. Tired the way a person got tired when they had been afraid for too long. When the fear had stopped being acute and had settled into something chronic and structural, a permanent low hum of dread that became the background noise of an entire life. She had felt the edges of that kind of tiredness herself during the worst months of trying to keep her family's business from collapsing, and she had told herself then that she would not let herself live inside it indefinitely. Looking at Silas Marsh, she thought, this is what indefinitely looks like. His apple pie arrived at 11:43. Clara set down her newspaper. She picked up her tea rose and walked to his table. "Mr. Marsh," she said quietly enough that it would not carry. "My name is Clara Bennett. I am Henry Bennett's daughter. I have been his bookkeeper for 7 years. I would very much appreciate 2 minutes of your time, and I promise that nothing I say will be said anywhere other than this table." Marsh looked up at her. She had expected calculation. She had expected wariness. She had expected the flat, controlled expression of a man who had spent years managing uncomfortable approaches by making himself into a wall. What she saw instead was recognition, not of her specifically, of the situation, of the precise species of trouble that had just sat down across from him, and the particular quality of a person who was not there to threaten, but to negotiate, and the specific terrible hope of a man who has been waiting for a door to open without being able to ask for one. He said, "Sit down, Miss Bennett." She sat. "You've been his bookkeeper for 7 years, Marsh said. Then you've seen the irregularities." "Yes," Clara said, "and you understand what they mean." "I do now," she said. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly, and I give you my word that your answer goes nowhere, except to the person I'm working with, who has every reason to want this resolved quietly, and none to make your situation worse than it already is." Marsh looked at her. He had the stillest eyes she had ever seen. Still the way water went still when it was very deep. "Ask," he said. "Do you have copies?" Clara said. "The originals, your own records kept separately. Do you have them?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. Clara counted. Then Marsh picked up his fork, cut a precise piece of apple pie, and said without looking up, "If I did, and I am not saying I do, but if I did." He paused. "What happens to the man who built the architecture?" "That depends on the man," Clara said, "and on how much of the architecture he built willingly." Marsh set down his fork. He looked at the table. When he looked up, the careful stillness in his face had developed a crack. Very small, very controlled. The kind of crack that appears in something that has been under pressure for a very long time. "I was 48 years old when Victor Harrington hired me," he said. "I had a wife and 2 daughters and a third on the way, and my previous employer had gone bankrupt, and I had been out of work for 7 months. Harrington found me. I was charming and generous, and he said he needed someone discreet. I told myself discretion was a professional virtue. I told myself for 12 years that discretion was a professional virtue." He stopped. "My youngest daughter is 18 now. She wants to study at the conservatory. She is talented. She deserves to study at the conservatory." Clara said nothing. "What I did," Marsh said quietly, "I cannot undo. I know that. I have known that for a long time." "What you can do," Clara said just as quietly, "is help stop what's still happening, and help ensure that the people who have been harmed have something to show for it." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "The man you're working with," he said. "Is it Whitmore?" Clara kept her face still. "Why would you ask that?" "Because Harrington has been afraid of Whitmore for 6 months, Marsh said. "Not obviously afraid. Harrington is never obvious. But I have kept his books for 12 years, and I know what his fear looks like in the margins. It looks like unusual cash transfers, and the sudden appearance of new shell accounts, and a pattern of destruction that moves faster than the original scheme. He is not building anymore. He is burning." Marsh picked up his fork again, and the steadiness of the gesture was almost absurd against everything he was saying. When a man like Victor Harrington starts burning evidence instead of building on it, it means he believes someone is close. Clara felt the cold move through her. "How close?" she said. "You're having breakfast with me," Marsh said. "I would say very close." She looked at him steadily. "Will you help us?" The pause was longer this time, long enough that the waiter refilled Marsh's water glass and moved away. Long enough that 2 men at a nearby table finished their conversation and left. Long enough that Clara heard the street sounds through the front window change quality as midday traffic built. Then Marsh said, "I have a box. It is kept in a location that is not my office and not my home, and that Harrington does not know about. I put things in it over 12 years when things came across my desk that I thought I might one day need. Not out of courage. I want to be clear about that. Out of fear. Because I always knew what a man like Victor did with people he no longer needed." Clara breathed, slow and even, not showing what that sentence did to her. "The box," she said. "Can you get it today?" "This afternoon," Marsh said. 3 o'clock. Tell Whitmore to send someone he trusts to the corner of Commonwealth and Clarendon. Not himself. Not you. Someone who is not connected to either of you." "All right," Clara said. She stood. She put 2 coins on the table for the tea. She looked at Marsh one last time, at this exhausted, precise, frightened man who had spent 12 years being complicit in something terrible, and another 12 years being quietly terrified by it. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Thank you." He did not look up from his pie. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Bennet. Wait and see if it's enough." She was 3 steps from the table when he said without raising his voice, "He knows about you, you know, more than you think. The night of the Langford ball, he had already been watching your father for 2 months. You were not an accident. He let you overhear that conversation." Clara stopped walking. She did not turn around. She stood very still facing the room and absorbed what Marsh had just told her and let it reorganize everything she had understood about the night she met Alexander Whitmore. Then she walked out of Dalton's and stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning air and thought. Victor had let her overhear. He had positioned her. The hallway, his conversation with her father, the calculated threat in language precise enough to frighten, but not precise enough to constitute evidence. He had engineered the situation to drive her out into the open, to force her to make a move that would reveal what she knew and who she would run to. Which meant he had expected Alexander. Which meant he had known, or at least strongly suspected, that Alexander's investigation existed, and he had used Clara as a way to find the edges of it. She had walked into Dalton's thinking she was hunting. Victor Harrington had been hunting first. Alexander was waiting for her around the corner. He read her face the moment he saw her, the way he had learned to read it over the past 2 weeks, and he said immediately, without preamble, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Marsh's willingness, the box, the 3 o'clock exchange, and then the last thing. The thing Marsh had said as she was leaving. Alexander was quiet for 3 seconds after she finished. "He engineered the hallway," Alexander said. "Yes. He wanted you to come to me. I wanted to find out if you had someone who could read the accounts, Clara said. He assumed that if you did, it would be someone inside your own company, someone he could already identify. He didn't account for the possibility that you would find someone external, someone he had already dismissed as inconsequential. He underestimated you, Alexander said. He underestimated both of us, Clara said, because we were supposed to be a known quantity, a powerful man and the woman he's protecting. Predictable, manageable. He thought we would proceed like people who were afraid of him. And instead, Alexander said, we proceeded like people who were angry at him, Clara said, which is something different. He looked at her with that quality she had stopped trying to name and had simply begun accepting as part of how he looked at her, like she was a thing he was still figuring out how to be certain of. The exchange at 3 o'clock, he said. I know someone. Someone Victor doesn't know. My attorney's clerk. Young, unremarkable, has run errands for the firm for 3 years and has never appeared on any document Victor would have access to. He paused. It will work. But Clara, if Victor is already watching us, there's another problem. She had already gotten there. My father. Victor doesn't need your father's ledgers anymore, Alexander said. He knows you have them, but your father is still a pressure point. If Victor decides that threatening you directly is no longer sufficient, he will go after your father through the business. He could move to foreclose on the silent partnership agreement as soon as tomorrow morning if he decides the situation has become urgent enough. Clara thought about her father's face, about the slowness she had noticed for 2 years, about what it would do to him to have the thing he had spent his life building taken publicly and loudly while his daughter stood there knowing she could have prevented it. How long does the 3 o'clock pickup need? She said. An hour, Alexander said. 2 if the materials are extensive. Then we need to give Victor something to look at for those 2 hours, Clara said. Something that makes him believe we are still moving at our pace rather than his. Alexander looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Clara said slowly, that we have spent 2 weeks very carefully being seen together in appropriate public settings. And that if this afternoon we were suddenly visible somewhere that Victor would find particularly significant, somewhere that suggested we are confident rather than urgent, it would signal to him that we don't know he engineered the hallway, that we still believe we're driving. Where? Alexander said. Clara said, the Union Club, your membership, his membership, the one room in Boston where both of you belong by right of standing, and where appearing together would read as a declaration rather than a transaction. Alexander was very still. You want to walk into the Union Club with me this afternoon. I want Victor Harrington to hear from 6 different people by supper time that you and Clara Bennett lunched at the Union Club looking perfectly at ease, she said. And while he is processing what that means, we have our 2 hours. The silence stretched. Then Alexander said, You understand that if we do this, there is no version of afterward where people believe the arrangement was fake. Clara held his gaze. I know. Another silence. Different in quality. The kind of silence that had started appearing between them over the past week that lived in a different register than their working conversations, and that neither of them had yet addressed directly, because addressing it directly would require them to stop performing sensibleness at each other. All right, Alexander said. The Union Club at noon. They walked in together at 12:15. And the effect was precisely what Clara had predicted, and nothing she had predicted. The room looked at them the way rooms look at people when the story has shifted. Not curiosity anymore, something more settled, something that had decided. She felt it move across the lunch tables in waves, the subtle recalibration of 200 years of Boston social assumption, and she felt Alexander's hand at the small of her back light and steadying, and she thought, we are doing this for strategy. And the thought was entirely true and also entirely insufficient. They were seated. They ordered. They talked with the particular ease of 2 people who had spent 2 weeks having conversations that mattered, which produced as a natural side effect the ability to have conversations that didn't matter in a way that looked genuinely comfortable. Your father, Alexander said midway through the meal. Has he asked you about the ledgers? Not directly, Clara said. He knows I take them home sometimes to work in the evenings. He wouldn't question it. When this is done, Alexander said carefully. He'll need to be told everything. He deserves to understand what happened to his company. All of it. I know, Clara said. I've been thinking about how to tell him. She paused. He's going to be devastated, not just about the money, about Victor. He considered Victor a friend. The loss of that will be worse than the financial damage. Alexander said, My father considered Victor's father a friend. Clara looked up. I haven't told you all of it, Alexander said. His voice stayed even, but she heard what was underneath it, that same carefully managed weight she had heard the night before in her entry hall. My father's personal journal, the one I found 2 years after he died. There was more in it than the financial investigation. Clara set down her fork. He wrote about a friendship, Alexander said. He and a woman named Margaret Whitfield, who handled the private accounts for a charitable organization my father supported. She died the year before he did. The journal said she had been helping him document the early evidence of the scheme, that she had access to records from the other side, from the charitable accounts that had also been targeted. He paused. He called her the most meticulous record keeper he had ever worked with. He said that without her, he would never have understood the full scope of what was being done. Clara's heart was beating in a strange way that she could not immediately explain. Margaret Whitfield, she said. Yes. Alexander, she said slowly. My mother's name before she married my father was Margaret Whitfield. The moment lasted a very long time. She watched it move through him, watched him absorb it and recalibrate and absorb it again, and she felt the exact same movement happening inside herself, that sensation of a puzzle piece, finding its place, not in the corner you had been trying to fit it into, but in a part of the picture you hadn't fully seen yet. Your mother, he said, was helping my father. Years before we met, Clara said. Years before that hallway. Years before any of this. She kept records, Alexander said. He wrote that she kept records separately, that she said she was making copies for safety. Clara felt something move through her chest that was complicated and large and not fully nameable. She thought about her mother, who had died when Clara was 19, who had been a small, precise woman with her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of seeing through things, and her mother's refusal to leave anything undocumented. She thought about the boxes she had helped her father pack after the funeral. The boxes of her mother's things, the ones he had kept in the back of his office because he could not bear to give them away. The box in my father's office, she said. The lower filing cabinet. Victor searched it the night he searched the office. What was in it? Alexander said. I thought it was the company charter and the founding deed, Clara said. Those were what my father told me he kept there. But my father also put my mother's things in his office after she died because he couldn't stand for them to be anywhere else. And if my mother was keeping separate records. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Victor searched that cabinet, Alexander said, and found it empty, Clara said, because I had already removed the ledgers. But the founding documents were not in the ledgers. They were separate. They would have been in a different location inside the cabinet. And if my mother's records were there as well. Victor has them now, Alexander said. The noise of the Union Club lunch continued around them, polished and indifferent, and Clara sat with the full weight of what this meant, and felt it settle into something that was not quite despair and not quite fury, but lived in the space between the two. He knows what she found, Clara said. He knows how much your father's investigation had already uncovered before your father died. He knows the evidence that existed, and he has had time to prepare for it, Alexander said, to discredit it, to construct an alternative account. Which means the box Marsh is collecting this afternoon, Clara said, may be the only thing we have that he hasn't already accounted for. They looked at each other across the table. The weight of this moment was not theatrical. It was not the dramatic crisis of a story where the obstacles exist to be overcome cleanly. It was the weight of a real thing, a real history of damage and silence and careful cruelty, extending back further than either of them had understood, connecting their families in a way neither of them had chosen, and now requiring them to finish something that two people who loved them had not lived to finish themselves. Alexander said, "We are not going to let it be enough for him." His voice was quiet. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was the voice of a man stating a fact he has decided is not negotiable. "No," Clara said. "We are not." They finished lunch. They walked out of the Union Club together, visible and unhurried, two people with nothing urgent pressing on them, and Clara felt every eye that tracked their exit and was grateful for every one of them. At 2:55, Alexander's attorney's clerk, a young man named Edmund, who had the forgettable quality of an excellent errand runner, was standing at the corner of Commonwealth and Clarendon. At 3 o'clock, a man in a gray coat approached the corner, set a leather case on the ground, said 3 words that Edmund would later report as simply, "Keep it safe," and walked away. Edmund brought the case to Alexander's office. They opened it together at 4:15 after Clara had arrived from a side entrance, and Thomas had locked the outer door and confirmed the hallway was empty. Inside the case were 12 years of Silas Marsh's private documentation, ledger copies, account records, transaction logs, correspondence in Victor's own hand instructing specific movements of funds, notes in Marsh's small precise writing, annotating each instruction with dates and amounts. 3 separate letters, sealed copies written by Marsh to himself at intervals over the years, describing in formal language exactly what he had been instructed to do, and by whom witnessed and notarized by a solicitor whose name Clara did not recognize, and who she suspected was also a man who had been keeping his own insurance. And at the very bottom of the case, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a string, a separate bundle of documents in a handwriting that was not Marsh's. Clara unwrapped it with hands that were not quite steady. The handwriting was small and precise and slanted slightly to the right, and she had seen it every day of her childhood on shopping lists and household accounts, and the letters her mother wrote to her sister in Providence, and she would have known it in her sleep. Her mother's handwriting, 23 pages of it, dates, account numbers, transaction records, names, and at the end, 2 pages of written narrative, explaining the pattern of fraud with the clarity of someone who understood accounts the way other people understood breathing. Clara sat down. She had not planned to sit down. Her knees made the decision independently. Alexander crouched beside her, not touching, not speaking, simply present in the way that he had become present over the past 2 weeks. The particular quality of his attention that made a person feel less alone without making them feel managed. She knew, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was going to keep it steady. She knew everything. The words came out with an evenness that cost her considerably. She died 3 months after your father died. I thought it was her heart. The physician said it was her heart. She stopped, started again. She was 51 years old, and her heart had always been perfectly sound. The room was very quiet. Alexander said nothing. He put his hand over hers where it lay on the oilcloth bundle, and he did not say anything at all, which was exactly right, which was the only thing that was exactly right in that moment. And Clara sat with her mother's handwriting in her lap, and 2 decades of a story she had not known she was living in, and let herself feel the full size of it for exactly 1 minute. Then she looked up. We have everything, she said. Marsh's records, your company's files, my father's ledgers, and now this. She looked at Alexander. Victor burned his evidence because he thought he knew what we had. He didn't know about Marsh's box. He didn't know my mother gave Marsh her copies. He still has what he took from your father's cabinet, Alexander said. Which means he has originals that our copies will now contradict, Clara said. And when the originals and the copies are compared, the question becomes not which one is real, but why someone went to the trouble of acquiring the originals. Which is its own kind of answer. Alexander looked at her. Something had shifted in his face. Not the calculation. Something beneath it. Clara, he said. Don't, she said gently. I wasn't going to say anything inappropriate. I know, she said. But whatever you were going to say it after, when this is done. She looked at her mother's handwriting one more time, folded it carefully, set it with the rest of the documents. We move tomorrow. We take everything to your attorney tonight, we make it unreachable, and tomorrow we end this. Alexander stood. He looked at the pile of documents on the table, 12 years of Marsh's fear and 2 decades of her mother's courage. and Clara watched something settle in him, the way a man looks when he has been walking toward a thing for a very long time and has just arrived. "Tomorrow," he said. But tomorrow, as Clara would learn before the evening was out, was already too late, because when Thomas unlocked the outer door at 5 o'clock to let in the evening air, he found an envelope on the mat outside, addressed in handwriting. They both recognized with 2 words on the outside that stopped them both cold. The envelope was addressed to Alexander. The 2 words were, "I know." Alexander opened the envelope, standing in the doorway, Thomas at his shoulder. Clara 2 steps behind him, and the 3 of them read the single page inside in the space of 10 seconds. It was not a threat. That was the first thing Clara registered. Victor Harrington had written threats before in the hallway of the Langford estate, in the careful language of a man who understood how to menace without leaving evidence of menace. This was not that. This was something colder and more precise than a threat. It was an invitation. The letter said, "Tomorrow morning. My office, 9 o'clock. Bring whatever you have found. There is something you do not yet know, and if you move against me before you hear it, you will regret it for the rest of your lives. Come alone, both of you." Clara read it twice. Then she looked at Alexander. His face was unreadable in the particular way it went unreadable when he was moving very fast inside, when the calculations were running too quickly to allow any expression through to the surface. "It's a trap," Thomas said. "Obviously," Alexander said. He stepped back inside. He set the letter on the desk next to the pile of Marsh's documents and stood looking at it with the same focus he gave the account ledgers, as though it were a financial record. He was trying to make yield information. It had not volunteered. "We don't go," Clara said. Alexander said nothing. "Alexander, we have everything we need. We take it to your attorney tonight. We place it in multiple hands as we planned, and we proceed without him. There is nothing he can tell us that changes what those documents say." "There is one thing he could tell us," Alexander said. She waited. He turned from the desk and looked at her, and his expression had opened slightly enough to let her see what was underneath, and what was underneath was not fear. It was something harder and older than fear. "My father," he said. "If there is something about my father's death that Victor knows, and we don't, something he has kept as a guarantee of his own safety. Then walking into that attorney's office tomorrow morning, without knowing what it is, means we will always be one piece short. We can convict him of fraud. We cannot convict him of what I actually believe he did." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her mother's handwriting on those 23 pages. She thought about the timeline. Her mother dead at 51. Alexander's father dead at 61, 3 months earlier. Both of them close to the truth. Both of them gone before they could act on it. She thought about Victor's smile. "He wants us frightened," she said. "The invitation is designed to put us off balance, to make us walk into a room where he controls the conditions." "I know," Alexander said, "and we're going anyway." She looked at him. "Not because he asked," Alexander said. "Because I need to look at the man who I believe killed my father, and I need to see his face when he understands that his evidence has been matched and exceeded. I need to see it. And if he has something to say before that happens, I am willing to hear it." The room was very quiet. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'll send word to Mr. Garnett tonight. Everything goes to his safe before midnight." "Yes," Alexander said. "All of it. Copies. Originals where we have them. The Marsh documents and Miss Bennett's ledgers and the Whitfield records." He paused. "And Thomas, if we have not contacted you by noon tomorrow, you go to Garnett and you tell him to proceed without us." Thomas looked at him steadily. "Understood, sir." Clara said nothing until Thomas had gone to begin the work of securing the documents. Then she said, "If Victor has something that implicates the deaths, he has been holding it for years, which means it's leverage, not evidence. He will offer to destroy it in exchange for our silence." "Probably," Alexander said. "And you will refuse." Without hesitation, she believed him. That was the thing about Alexander Whitmore that she had come to understand over the past 2 weeks, that his certainties were not performed certainties. They were the quiet, load-bearing kind that a person arrived at through a long time alone with difficult questions. Then we go, she said. Together, at 9 o'clock. And we do not give him a single moment where he believes he is in control of that room. Alexander looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than any equivalent moment had lasted before. Clara, he said. You said to wait until this was done, she said. I said say it after, he corrected very quietly. You said wait until this is done. I said I wasn't going to say anything inappropriate. She held his gaze. I'm not sure anymore, he said slowly, that this arrangement means what I originally told you it meant. The after part. The way I described it. The room was very still. No, Clara said. I'm not sure either. She left before either of them could make the conversation more complicated than they were currently equipped to handle, and went home to her father's house, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and did not sleep for the second night in a row. She was there still at the kitchen table, when her father came downstairs at 6 in the morning. I was surprised to find her there. He was more surprised when she looked up at him and said quietly and without preamble, Papa, sit down. There are some things I need to tell you. She told him everything. She had planned to be careful about it to manage the sequence to cushion the hardest parts with context and explanation, the way a person carefully wraps something fragile before putting it down. But she was very tired, and her father's face in the early morning light was the face of a man who had been carrying his own version of this weight for 2 years, and she understood suddenly that protecting him from it had also been its own kind of diminishment. He deserved to know. Henry Bennet listened without interrupting. He was a quiet man by nature, her father the kind of man who processed things internally and thoroughly before speaking, and he sat across from her with his hands folded on the table and his face very still, while she laid out everything she and Alexander had found, and what it meant, and what it pointed to. When she was done, he was silent for a long time. Then he said in a voice that was rougher than usual, Your mother knew. Yes, Clara said. She was documenting it. She was helping Robert Whitmore build the case before either of them died. Her father looked at his hands. Clara watched him absorb this. Watched the complicated grief of a man discovering that his wife had been carrying something enormous in the last years of her life, and had not told him perhaps to protect him, perhaps because she was who she was, which was to say, practical and precise, and inclined to do the work herself rather than worry someone she loved. She was protecting us, Henry said. She was protecting all of us, Clara said. She was trying to stop it before it got worse. She ran out of time, her father said. Yes. He was quiet again. Then he said with a directness that surprised her, This man Whitmore, what is he to you? Clara had prepared for this question. She had not prepared an adequate answer. He is someone I trust, she said carefully. Her father looked at her with the particular quality of attention that fathers deploy when they have decided to see through the careful answer to the real one. Clara, he said, I am 60 years old, and I have made a considerable number of mistakes in my life, but I was not a foolish young man, and I am not a foolish old one. Is he someone you trust, or is he someone you trust and something more? Clara met her father's eyes. Something more, she said. I haven't said it to him yet. Henry Bennet nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he had already surmised. Good, he said. Good, Clara said, slightly startled. You have spent 7 years taking care of everyone else, her father said, including me, including your sisters, including this family's problems, which were not your problems to carry alone, but which you carried alone because that is who you are. He looked at her with something that made her chest tight. Your mother was the same way. She carried things alone and it cost her. I should have seen more of it than I did. His voice roughened. Don't make her mistakes, Clara. Or mine. Clara sat with her father's words and felt them settle into a part of her she had not expected to open this morning. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat like that in the early morning quiet for a minute that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Then she said, I have to go. There's something that needs to be finished this morning. I know, he said. Go finish it. Victor Harrington's offices occupied the top floor of a building on State Street all polished wood, and the particular kind of deliberate elegance that announced wealth in a way that was meant to make other people feel the distance between themselves and it. Clara noticed this on the way in, and found to her own satisfaction that she did not feel it. She had stopped feeling that particular distance sometime in the past 2 weeks, and she was not certain whether to credit Alexander or her mother, or simply the accumulated effect of having been too angry and too busy to feel small. They were shown in at 9 o'clock exactly. Victor was already seated. He had coffee on the table, and an expression of composed pleasantness that Clara recognized as the performance of a man who has decided which version of himself serves his current purpose. He looked at them. He looked between them. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite surprise, but was the cousin of it. "You came together," he said. "We do everything together," Alexander said pleasantly. He sat down without being invited to. Clara sat beside him. Victor looked at them for a moment. Then he leaned back and said, "You've been to see Marsh." Neither of them confirmed it. Neither of them denied it. Clara had learned enough from 2 weeks with Alexander to understand that silence was sometimes the most expensive thing you could spend. Victor read their silence and arrived at his own conclusion. "He gave you his box. Still nothing." Victor smiled, but it was different from his usual smile. Thinner. More precisely constructed. "You think you have everything," he said. "You think those documents are sufficient. They're not." "Tell us what you think we're missing," Alexander said. "The question isn't what you're missing," Victor said. "The question is what I have that you can't afford to have presented to the wrong people." He reached into his desk drawer and placed a folder on the table. He did not open it. "Your father Whitmore. In the last 6 months of his life, he made a series of very unusual financial decisions. Transfers from company accounts to a personal account that was not registered in his name. Large transfers. The kind that presented in the correct context, without the explanation that only I can provide, look like a man moving money before his creditors could reach it." Alexander's jaw tightened, just slightly. Clara felt it more than saw it. "Those transfers were part of my father's investigation," Alexander said. "He was creating a separate account to preserve evidence funds." "Of course he was," Victor said smoothly. "And I know that. But what a judge would see presented with those records, and without the context, is a man who was defrauding his own company before his death, and whose son has therefore spent 6 months pursuing a vendetta against the man who discovered the fraud, rather than acknowledging the crime." He paused. "I am not telling you this is true. I am telling you this is how it will be presented. And once it is presented, the conversation becomes about Robert Whitmore's character rather than mine." The room was very still. Clara watched Alexander, and she watched Victor, and she watched the shape of what Victor had constructed, and she understood it completely, the same way she understood financial architecture, the way a scheme becomes visible once you know what the structure is meant to conceal. She said, "You've been holding those records for 4 years. Victor glanced at her. He did not bother to disguise the assessment in his look. She was still to him a secondary consideration, a piece on the board. "Yes," he said, "as insurance, against exactly this eventuality." "You held them for 4 years, Clara said. "And in 4 years, you never used them. You never presented them anywhere. You never allowed any part of that story to circulate." She looked at him steadily. "Because the moment you do, a very obvious question arises. Why did Victor Harrington, a man who claims to have discovered evidence of his business partner's fraud, wait 4 years before reporting it? What did he have to gain from the silence? And what was he doing during those 4 years that required Robert Whitmore's reputation to remain intact while he was doing it?" Victor looked at her. The pleasantness in his face did not disappear, but something behind it shifted. "You're describing the problem with your own leverage," Clara continued. "The moment you use those records, they become a question about your conduct as much as his. And once that question is in the room, everything else we have becomes the answer," Alexander said without inflection. "My father was not a fraudster. You know that and I know that. But more importantly, we now know what actually happened to those funds, because my father documented every transfer in a private journal that you did not find, and which has been in a sealed and witnessed location for the past 2 years, and which my attorney received last night along with everything else. This was not entirely true. The journal had not been in a sealed location for 2 years. But Victor could not know that. And Clara watched the information land, and watched Victor's face process it, the specific expression of a man calculating whether a bluff is real and finding that he cannot afford to assume it isn't. "You are overestimating what you have," Victor said. But the pleasantness had thinned further. "Then let us tell you what we have," Clara said, "and you can tell us which parts we're wrong about." She listed it. All of it. Marsh's documents, the shell accounts, the transaction records going back 12 years, the letters in Victor's own hand, the notarized contemporaneous records Marsh had kept. Her mother's documentation, 23 pages of it, establishing the pattern as far back as 18 years. Her own family's ledgers, with every manipulated entry annotated and cross-referenced. Alexander's company files connecting the same account numbers across 9 different businesses. She listed it in the same voice she used when she presented accounts to her father. Calm, specific, sequential. Not performing confidence, simply having it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Victor was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the smile, and it was not the calculation beneath the smile. It was something rawer than either of those, something she recognized because she had felt the edges of it herself in the worst moments of the past 2 years. It was the look of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on has run out. He recovered. She had to give him that. He recovered in about 4 seconds, which was faster than most people would have managed, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost as smooth as it had been when they walked in. "Everything you've described," he said, "goes through a legal process, a long one, in which I will have every opportunity to present my own evidence and my own interpretation. These things take years, Miss Bennett. And during those years, your father's company, which is technically still under the terms of our original partnership agreement, will remain in a state of legal ambiguity, which means he cannot sell it, cannot refinance it, cannot make any significant operational decisions without my agreement." Years. Miss Bennett, how old is your father? How many years does he have to wait? Clara had been waiting for this. She had discussed it with Alexander 2 nights ago, had identified it as the pressure point Victor would eventually reach for the one weapon he had left when everything else was gone. She looked at him. "My father's company," she said, "came out of the partnership agreement 3 weeks ago." Victor stared. "Under the terms of the original agreement," Clara said, "the silent partnership dissolves automatically if the senior partner, that is my father, files a written declaration of dissolution with the commercial registry, accompanied by evidence of the partner's failure to meet his documented obligations. My father filed that declaration 11 days ago. The registry accepted it 8 days ago. Bennett Textiles is no longer under any obligation to Victor Harrington, and has not been for the better part of 2 weeks. Alexander had arranged this quietly through Garnett 10 days ago, the moment they had established enough documentation to support the filing. Clara had signed the accompanying affidavit herself. Victor's face did something she had never seen it do. It went blank. Genuinely blank, the blankness of a man whose script has just been removed from his hands mid-performance. She pressed forward while he was still finding his footing. "You have 2 choices," she said. "The same 2 you offered me in that hallway 3 weeks ago, because I think it's important that you understand how that felt from the other side." She kept her voice even. She did not allow herself the satisfaction of hardness, because hardness would have made this about her, and this was not about her. "Everything we have goes to your attorney and ours, and the appropriate legal authorities, and you spend the next several years defending yourself against a case built from 12 years of meticulous records kept by a man who has been terrified of you for every one of those years. Or—" She paused exactly the way he had paused in the hallway. "You sign a full confession of the scheme, including every business you targeted and every dollar you extracted. You make a documented commitment to restitution, and you resign from every board and organization and business association you currently hold a position in. You do not leave Boston, because leaving Boston looks like guilt and creates additional legal complications. You simply cease to operate as though you have power you no longer possess. The silence stretched. Victor looked at Alexander. Looking for the masculine authority in the room, the same reflex he had demonstrated in the hallway when Alexander had appeared, the same instinct that had led him to dismiss Clara as the secondary element of this partnership 3 weeks ago and every day since. Alexander said, "She's the one making the offer. You should answer her." Something collapsed in Victor's face, not dramatically. Not the way it happened in stories where the villain crumbles visibly and completely and leaves no doubt about what has occurred. It was smaller than that, and more real, and in some ways more terrible. It was a man of 60 years, recognizing in the space of 30 seconds that the architecture he had built across decades had been disassembled by a 26-year-old woman with her mother's handwriting and her father's stubbornness, and 3 weeks of extraordinarily focused anger. He looked at Clara Bennett and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Who are you?" It was not strategic. It was not rhetorical. It was a genuine question from a man who had encountered something he had not budgeted for. Clara said, "I am the bookkeeper for my father's textile company. I am the woman you cornered in a hallway because you thought I was someone you could frighten. And I am the daughter of Margaret Whitfield, who spent the last years of her life documenting what you were doing and making sure someone would eventually find it." She stood up. "That is who I am. And now I would like your answer." Victor looked at the table. He looked at the folder he had placed there, the one containing his insurance, the one he had held for 4 years and never used, and which he now understood he could never use, not without the consequences Clara had described, not without turning his leverage into a shovel he had dug his own grave with. He said, "I will need to speak with my attorney." "You have 24 hours, Alexander said. "After that we proceed without your participation." They stood to leave. Clara picked up her coat and turned toward the door, and had almost reached it when Victor said behind her, "Your mother was the best financial analyst I ever encountered. I want you to know that. I knew when I understood what she was doing that she was better than anyone I employed." Clara stopped walking. She stood with her back to him for 3 seconds. Then she said without turning around, "She was. And she would have stopped you 30 years ago if you hadn't made sure she ran out of time." She walked out. Alexander was beside her in the hallway, his shoulder close to hers, and they walked together to the stairs and down and out into the cold morning air of State Street. And Clara did not stop walking until they had rounded the corner and were out of the line of sight of Victor's building. And then she stopped, and she stood very still, and she breathed. Alexander stopped beside her. She was not crying. She would not cry here on State Street on an ordinary Wednesday morning with people walking past and carriages moving, and the city being entirely indifferent to the fact that something enormous had just shifted inside her. She was not going to cry. She breathed. Alexander said nothing. He simply stood beside her with the quiet, steady quality that she had come to rely on, in a way she had not fully admitted to herself, and waited for her to return to herself. After a minute she said, "He knew what he was doing to her. He knew she was close, and he knew exactly what he was doing." "Yes," Alexander said. He did not dress it differently. He did not offer her a more comfortable version of it. He simply confirmed it because she deserved the truth confirmed rather than softened. "And your father," Clara said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him. The morning light was doing something specific to his face, revealing the tiredness in it that he usually kept below the surface, the 4 years of carrying this, the 6 months of investigating without certainty, and underneath all of it. Something she recognized because she had seen it looking back at her from mirrors during the worst of the past 2 years. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been doing the hardest thing alone for far too long. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. She had not planned to do it. Her hand did it before the plan could form. She felt him go very still in the way he went still when something surprised him, and she looked at him steadily and said, "It's over. We finished it. Both of them." He put his hand over hers. He held it there against his face for a moment, and she felt something move through him that he did not allow himself to show in any other way. And she understood that this was enough, that this was the right size for this moment, that the larger things could be said later when they had both had time to sleep and breathe and become themselves again. Both of them, he agreed. He lowered her hand, but did not let go of it, and they stood on the corner of State Street on a Wednesday morning in November, with the whole city moving around them, and Clara thought about her mother, and about Alexander's father, and about the 23 pages of careful handwriting that had survived 12 years in a frightened man's box and made it into the right hands at last. She thought you finished it. She thought we finished it for you. Victor Harrington's attorney contacted Garnett's office at 7 o'clock that evening. The confession was signed before midnight. Victor Harrington's confession was 4 pages long and written in the precise lawyerly language of a man who had spent his entire life understanding exactly where the lines were drawn and exactly how close he could stand to them. It named 9 businesses. It named Silas Marsh as the architect of the financial structure, with the specific clarification added at Marsh's attorney's insistence and Garnett's agreement that Marsh had operated under duress and had cooperated fully with the investigation. It named dollar amounts. It named dates. It named the shell accounts and the false suppliers and the paper companies that had existed for no purpose other than to move money from people who had earned it to a man who had decided he deserved it more. It did not name what had happened to Robert Whitmore and Margaret Whitfield. There was not enough direct evidence for that, and Garnett had been honest with Alexander about the limits of what the confession could contain. Suspicion was not proof. Timing was not proof. The specific horror of believing something and being unable to prove it was a thing Alexander had lived with for 4 years, and he would continue to live with some portion of it, because the law required a different standard of certainty than the human heart. But Clara had watched Alexander read the 4 pages in Garnett's office at midnight, and she had watched him absorb the absence of those 2 names, and she had watched him fold the pages with the same careful control he brought to everything. And she had heard him say quietly to no one in particular, "It's enough. It will have to be enough." Garnett delivered copies to the Boston Transcript and to 3 other publications the following morning. By noon the story was in the streets. Clara was at her father's kitchen table when Eliza came running in with the paper, breathless and wide-eyed the way Eliza did everything at full speed and with complete commitment. "Clara," she said, dropping the paper on the table. "It's everywhere. Victor Harrington. Everything. It's all there." Henry Bennett came in from his study, drawn by the noise, and stood in the kitchen doorway, and Eliza read the article aloud, because she could not help herself, because Eliza had always processed things better when she could hear them spoken. Clara sat with her tea and listened to her sister read the story of the past 3 weeks laid out in newsprint, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph. She had expected triumph. She had spent 3 weeks working toward something, and it was done now, and triumph seemed like the appropriate response. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. Something that had to do with her mother's handwriting on 23 pages. Something that had to do with the 2 years she had sat alone with the ledgers and known something was wrong and not been able to fix it. Something that had to do with the specific weight of a secret kept for the right reasons and the specific relief of putting it down. Her father, standing in the doorway, said nothing until Eliza finished. Then he said, "Your mother would have liked to see that." Clara looked up at him. "She would have been very pleased," he said. "She would have also wanted to check the transcript's arithmetic, because she never trusted that their financial correspondent understood compound interest." He paused, and the pause contained 40 years of knowing one person deeply. But she would have been pleased. Eliza looked between her father and Clara, with the expression of someone who understood that something larger than a newspaper article was being discussed, and had the unusual wisdom to say nothing. Clara stood up and hugged her father, which was not something she did often enough, which was something she intended to correct, and her father held on with the particular grip of a man who had almost lost something he had not known he was close to losing. The days that followed were strange in a way Clara had not prepared for. She had prepared for the legal proceedings, which Garnett managed with the steady competence of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case. She had prepared for the social fallout, the rapid and somewhat undignified repositioning of Boston's prominent families, who had aligned themselves with Victor Harrington, and now needed to demonstrate that they had never really aligned themselves with Victor Harrington. She had prepared for the practical work of helping the 9 affected businesses understand what they were owed and how the restitution process would function. She had not prepared for the silence. Not a bad silence. Not the silence of emptiness or aftermath. It was the silence of a woman who had been running at full speed for 3 weeks and had stopped and discovered that stopping required its own kind of adjustment. Her body did not know how to be still. Her mind kept reaching for problems that were no longer there, kept circling back to the ledgers and the documents and the next step, and finding only open space where the urgency had been. She threw herself into the restitution work because it was real and useful, and because it turned out that her particular skills, the ability to read financial records and identify exactly where damage had occurred, and calculate exactly what restoration would require, were precisely what the 9 affected businesses needed. Garnett connected her with 5 of them in the first week. She sat at kitchen tables and in business offices, and once memorably in the back room of a cobbler's shop where a 70-year-old man wept quietly when she showed him the exact dollar amount he would be receiving back. She did not consider this extraordinary. She considered it work that needed doing. Alexander called on her 4 days after the confession was signed. He came to her father's house in the late afternoon, which was a social call and not a working meeting. And this distinction registered in Clara's chest in a way she had been managing through the simple expedient of staying very busy. How was shown into the sitting room. Clara came downstairs to find him standing rather than sitting because he was a man who stood when he was thinking and sat only when he had arrived at something, and he was still in the process of arriving at whatever had brought him here. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been working," she said. "Clara." "I know," she said. "Yes, I've been slightly avoiding you." He looked at her with the patience of a man who has decided to wait. She had learned over 3 weeks that his patience was genuine and not tactical, that he was actually willing to wait as long as a thing required, which was simultaneously one of his best qualities and one of the most disarming. She came into the room and sat down. He sat across from her. "The arrangement," she said. "The original one. You said we would part amicably, quietly, in a way that damages neither of us." "I remember what I said," he said. "I have been trying to determine," Clara said carefully, "whether what I feel about that has more to do with the past 3 weeks or with something that existed before the past 3 weeks. Because those are different things, and one of them is more reliable than the other." Alexander watched her. "Intense circumstances produce intense feelings," she said. "I am aware of this. I am trying to be honest with myself about which feelings are the circumstance and which feelings are the person." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what have you concluded?" Clara met his eyes. "I concluded," she said, "that the night of the Langford ball when you offered to walk me back into that ballroom I had approximately 30 seconds to decide whether to trust a stranger. And I trust very slowly. I always have. My father will tell you that I did not trust the new supplier my father hired 4 years ago for 11 months until he had given me 11 months of accurate invoices. 11 months. She paused. "I trusted you in 30 seconds. And I have been trying to explain that to myself ever since, and I cannot explain it by the circumstances, because the circumstances should have made me less trusting, not more." The room was very quiet. Alexander said, "The night I saw Victor holding your arm, I was on the other side of the room. I had never spoken to you. I did not know your name. And I walked across that room because something in me had already decided before I had the information to decide it, that whatever was happening in that hallway was not going to continue." Clara said nothing. "I told myself it was strategic," he said. "That I needed someone who could read accounts. That was true. It remained true for approximately 4 days, and then it became insufficient as an explanation, and I kept adding it to my reasoning anyway, because the alternative required me to acknowledge something I was not ready to acknowledge." "Which was," Clara said. He looked at her directly. "That I had walked across that room because I could not walk across it, and that every decision I made in the 3 weeks that followed had at least 2 layers of motivation, and I was only honest with myself about one of them. Clara breathed, slow and even. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I have spent 7 years being a bookkeeper and a daughter and a sister, and I have been competent at all of those things. This is a different category." "I don't know how to do this either," Alexander said. "I am apparently regarded by Boston society as the coldest man in any room, which I find somewhat unfair, but not entirely inaccurate. I have spent a great deal of my life keeping people at a distance that I calculated was appropriate." "Why?" Clara asked, not accusatory, genuinely. I was quiet for a moment. "Because people who got close to my father were people who could be used against him. I watched that happen when I was young, and I decided it was a risk I would not take." He paused. "And then I spent 6 months investigating Victor Harrington's crimes, and then I watched you walk into a restaurant and sit down across from a frightened man with 12 years of secrets, and I understood that my calculation had been wrong. That the real risk was not letting people close. The real risk was remaining so far away from everything that nothing real could reach you." Clara sat with this for a moment. "Alexander," she said, "when this is over," you said. "When we were standing outside Victor's office, I said say it after. You said I said to wait until this was done." "Yes," he said. "This is done," she said. He stood up. She stood up. The room, which was her father's sitting room with its familiar furniture and the particular afternoon light that had come through these windows for as long as she could remember, felt like something else now, like a space that was rewriting its own history, slightly adding a new layer to all the things it had held. Alexander crossed the room and stopped in front of her close enough that she could see all the things he kept below his surface, the directness of him and the tiredness and the particular quality of attention he had given her from the first moment in that hallway, which was the attention of a man who was actually looking. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your father's knowledge and your consent, and in the full light of day, with none of it being pretend." Clara looked up at him. "You already know my worst qualities," he said. "You have watched me be calculating and closed off, and occasionally so focused on the problem that I forget there are people attached to it. I am not a simple man to be close to." "I am not a simple woman," Clara said. "I annotate ledgers at 3 in the morning, and I distrust new suppliers for 11 months, and I have been carrying my family's financial troubles alone for 7 years because I did not know how to stop." "I know," he said. "I know all of that. And you're asking anyway." "I am asking because of all of that," he said, "not in spite of it." The sitting room was very quiet. Clara thought about the 30 seconds in the hallway. She thought about her mother's handwriting and the specific quality of trust that had been folded into those 23 pages kept safe in a frightened man's box for 12 years, waiting for the right hands. She thought about her father's face at the kitchen table that morning saying, "Don't make her mistakes," or mine. She said yes. Alexander smiled. It was not the controlled, measured expression she had learned to read over 3 weeks. It was something genuinely private, something that arrived without permission, and it changed his entire face in a way that she found she wanted to study at considerable length. She said, "Don't look so surprised." "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm glad. There's a difference." "You said that to me once before," she said, "about being impressed versus surprised." "I'm consistent," he said. "You are," she agreed. "I find it reassuring." He reached out and took her hand the way he had taken it that first night, deliberate and steady, and she felt the same thing she had felt then, that unlocking of something she had been holding, clenched the release of a tension she had been carrying so long she had mistaken it for her natural state. The days that came after had a different quality than the days before, not easier necessarily. The legal proceedings around Victor's case were extensive and required months of careful documentation and testimony, and Clara was in the middle of all of it, consulting on the financial evidence, helping other businesses understand the records, working alongside Garnett and Alexander's legal team with the same focused competence she brought to everything. There were difficult days when the testimony required her to sit in rooms and hear the full scope of what had been done, described in clinical legal language, when the numbers that represented other people's losses became undeniable in ways that made her chest tight. There were the days when Silas Marsh testified. He was composed and precise on the stand in the small, neat way of a man who has spent 12 years compressing himself into careful corners, and when his testimony was done, he sat for a moment in the witness chair and looked at his hands, and Clara, watching from across the room, understood that what she was seeing was a man putting something down that he had been carrying for longer than she had been alive. The judge noted his cooperation in terms that would ultimately reduce his liability substantially. His youngest daughter, Clara, learned later, did attend the conservatory. There were the days when the restitution reached individual families, when the calculations Clara had made in other people's back rooms and sitting rooms and offices became actual amounts delivered to actual people. And when she received letters, some of them barely literate, some of them formal, some of them simply a few words that cost the writer everything they had in the way of expression, that said, "Thank you. We thought it was gone. We thought it was gone, and there was nothing we could do." She kept every one of those letters. And there were the evenings which became their own category. Alexander came to her father's house 3 times a week, which was proper and observed and noted approvingly by every social columnist in Boston, a development that Clara found both mildly amusing and privately satisfying. He and her father developed a relationship she had not anticipated, built on a mutual respect for directness, and on the specific bond of 2 people who had loved the same woman from different distances, and had both in different ways been trying to finish something she had started. Her father showed Alexander the box of her mother's things. Not all of it. But the letters, the correspondence with Robert Whitmore, the early pages of what had become the 23-page document. Alexander sat at her father's kitchen table and read her mother's handwriting for a long time without speaking. And when he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that he did not try to conceal. He said, "She would have been extraordinary in any field she chose." Henry Bennett said, "She was extraordinary in every field she touched, including the one that mattered most." He looked at his daughters, both of them at the table, Eliza pretending to read and absorbing every word. She was a remarkable mother. Clara looked at her father and felt for the first time in 2 years that the weight she had been carrying in his vicinity was something she could set aside, not forget, not pretend hadn't existed, but put down properly in a way that allowed her to stand differently. There was an evening, 6 weeks after the confession was signed, when Alexander and Clara were sitting in her father's garden in the cold November dark, with the last of the autumn, refusing to give way entirely, and he said without preamble, in the way he said things that mattered, "I want to show you something." He had a letter. Folded old, the paper soft with handling. He passed it to her. She unfolded it carefully. It was from his father. Written by the date at the top 3 weeks before Robert Whitmore died. Written to his son. Though it read more like a man writing to himself, organizing his thoughts in the way that people organized thoughts when they could not be certain who would eventually read them. It said, "I have been working with a woman named Margaret Whitfield, who has the most precise financial mind I have encountered in 40 years of business. She is afraid for her family, and she is working anyway, which is the definition of courage as far as I am concerned. If anything happens before we finish this, I hope someone finds a way to complete what we started. I hope someone finds her work and understands what she was doing. She deserves to have it matter." Clara read it twice. She folded it carefully. She held it for a moment. Then she looked up at Alexander, and he was watching her with the full, steady attention she had come to understand was the most complete thing he knew how to give. She said, "It mattered." "Yes," he said. "We made sure it mattered." "Yes," he said again. "We did." She handed the letter back. He took it and folded it into his coat pocket, closed the way you kept something you intended to keep for a very long time. She said, "Alexander." He waited. "When you asked me to pretend to love you," she said, "in the hallway, you said just for tonight." "I remember." "Did you believe it?" she said. "When you said it, did you actually believe it would only be one night?" He thought about this with the seriousness he gave everything that deserved seriousness. "No," he said. "I think somewhere I already knew it wouldn't be. I told myself I was being strategic, but I think the real answer is that I had been alone for a very long time, and something in that hallway told me that what was happening was not going to resolve itself in one night." He looked at her. I was right about that." "You were right about that," she agreed. They sat in the cold garden in the dark, and Boston went on around them, the way cities went on, indifferent and relentless, and full of people living their own complicated lives. And Clara sat beside the man who had walked across a ballroom for reasons he did not fully understand, and changed the entire direction of her life. And she felt something she had not felt in 7 years of ledgers, and worrying, and carrying things alone. She felt like herself, the full version of herself. The version that existed not in opposition to the fear, but on the other side of it, standing in the open, with both hands empty, because she had finally put everything she had been holding in the right places. The legal case concluded in the spring. Victor Harrington was found liable on 11 counts. The financial penalties were extensive. The restitution fund disbursed over $300,000 to affected parties over the following 18 months. Victor resigned from 7 boards, 2 charitable organizations, and his membership in the Union Club, which caused more comment in some quarters than any of the financial news, which Clara found both depressing and completely unsurprising. Silas Marsh relocated with his family to Providence, where his youngest daughter attended the conservatory, and his wife ran a small accounting practice, which was reported to Clara by a mutual correspondent, and which she found in its way a satisfying ending to a sad story. And on a Thursday morning in April, in a small ceremony, attended by their immediate families, and Garnett and Thomas and the cobbler, whose shop Clara had sat in, and who had wept at the return of what he was owed. Clara Bennett and Alexander Whitmore were married in the parlor of her father's house. She wore her mother's brooch. It was the only thing from her mother's jewelry box that she had asked for, the small enameled one that her mother had worn at every important occasion. The one that had sat at the throat of the woman who had spent the last years of her life doing something brave and necessary in the way that quiet people did brave and necessary things without announcing it, without being certain anyone would see it. Someone had seen it. Someone had found it and finished it, Eliza cried. She did so openly and without apology, because that was who Eliza was, and everyone present found this entirely appropriate. Henry Bennett did not cry, but he held Clara's hands before she went into the parlor, and he said, "Your mother would have been impossibly proud of you. She would have also wanted to review the marriage contract to make sure the terms were favorable." Clara laughed, which was exactly what her father had intended, and the laugh carried into the parlor, and was the sound that greeted Alexander as she entered, and he looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over 5 months of knowing him, the one that was not surprise and not calculation, and not the controlled public face, but the real one, the one reserved for the moments when he was not performing any version of himself, but simply being the person he actually was. She reached him and took his hands and held them and looked at him steadily. He said very quietly, so only she could hear, "I don't need you to pretend anymore." She said just as quietly, "I know. I haven't been pretending for a very long time." The years that followed told their own story. Alexander and Clara built something together that was not what either of them had originally imagined their lives would look like, because neither of them had imagined particularly clearly before, had only managed and planned and protected and worked without allowing themselves to want a future rather than just a next step. What they built was specific and warm and grounded in the same directness that had defined them from the first night, the refusal to pretend that things were other than they were. The willingness to say the hard thing in the plain language, because they had both learned what the cost of silence was. Clara continued the restitution work long after the legal case was closed. She was good at it in a way that turned out to be needed well beyond Boston, and she was not humble about this, the way she had once been humble about everything, because she had learned over 5 months that competence was not something to minimize. She helped establish a formal financial review process for charitable organizations in the city that her mother would have, as her father had correctly predicted, wanted to audit personally. Alexander's railroad company expanded in ways that became in their own right a significant chapter in Boston's industrial history. But the thing Alexander himself seemed to find most meaningful was the Workers' Support Fund he established in the 2nd year of their marriage, drawn directly from his father's personal writings, from the parts of that journal that had nothing to do with Victor Harrington. The parts where Robert Whitmore had written about the families who depended on his decisions and his belief that a businessman's first obligation was to the people whose labor made the business possible. Clara found those pages the most important thing in the journal. She was not surprised. She had recognized that quality in Alexander from the second week, when she had learned he quietly supported struggling workers and protected families who depended on him. It was not a quality that Boston's social world associated with him. She had always thought this said more about Boston's social world than it did about Alexander. They had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter was named Margaret, which required no explanation to anyone who knew the family's history. She had her grandmother's eyes and her mother's habit of sitting at kitchen tables in the early morning, working through problems that had kept her up in the night, and her father's quality of stillness, and her own completely individual quality of noticing things other people missed, which she demonstrated from approximately age 4, and which Clara recognized and refused to diminish. Henry Bennett lived to meet all 3 of his grandchildren. He met Margaret when she was 3 weeks old, and held her with the careful steadiness of a man who understood that he was holding something precious and was not going to pretend otherwise, and he said to Clara, without looking up from the baby's face, "She has her grandmother's hands." Clara said, "I know." "Margaret would have loved this," he said. "I know that too," Clara said. On the 20th anniversary of the night at the Langford estate, Clara found the draft of Alexander's original words to her, written in his own hand, in a small journal he kept. Not a financial journal, a personal one, the private kind of record that the most careful people kept separately from the official version of events. She had not been looking for it. She had found it on his desk while looking for something else, and it had fallen open, and the words had been there. He had written them out the morning after the ball, she realized by the date. He had written, "I told her to pretend. But I think I was the one who was pretending. Pretending that I was only being strategic. Pretending that I would be satisfied with one night. Pretending that what I felt when I walked across that room was a calculation rather than the most honest thing I had done in years." She closed the journal and put it back exactly where she had found it and said nothing about it. She didn't need to. They had both stopped pretending a very long time ago, and everything that was real between them had been spoken or shown or confirmed in the 20 years of an ordinary and extraordinary life built out of honesty and stubbornness, and the specific courage of 2 people who had learned from the people who loved them that the truth was always worth the cost of saying it. Because this was what Clara Bennett knew in the end, after everything: love was not the pretending. Love was the moment you stopped. Love was choosing the real thing when the pretend version would have been easier and safer and far less likely to turn your entire life into something you had never planned for and could not have managed without. She had not planned for any of it. Not the hallway, not the kiss, not the ledgers, or the terrified bookkeeper, or her mother's handwriting in a box she had not known to look for. She had not planned for Alexander Whitmore, who had walked across a room for reasons that turned out to be truer than either of them knew. She had not planned for any of it, and every single day of it had been exactly true.